Let's talk about the 3 most common mistakes I see bodybuilders make in their training. Mistake number 1, bodybuilders fail to understand and apply the principle of progressive overload. Progressive overload is evidenced by increases in difficulty in your training. So what does that mean? Essentially what it means is that your training needs to get harder over time, and in doing so, you'll engender progress and avoid plateaus. So this is most typically evidenced by increases of weight on the bar while maintaining the same number of reps, or increases of reps while maintaining the same weight, or a combination of both. So let's make this really concrete. Last week you benched 185 for 5. This week you're benching 190 for 5, or you're benching 185 for 6. That's progressive overload. You can also evidence progressive overload by improving your form so that you're actually using the target tissues better and getting a greater stimulus. Lastly, some people demonstrate progressive overload through density training, where essentially you take a set rep and weight scheme and you slowly reduce the rest times over time and then add weight. This can work, but you may run into some complications as you may be hindered by your cardiovascular fitness. Now, bodybuilders tend to make 3 mistakes in the realm of progressive overload. 1, they seem to think that adding volume is a form of progressive overload. Adding volume can be really useful. It can strengthen the hypertrophic response your body is receiving from the training. But it's not progressive overload because it's not actually evidence of progress. So again, let's make this concrete. Let's say on Tuesday, you benched 185 for 2 sets of 5, and then Thursday, you benched 185 for 3 sets of 5. Well, you can't look at those 2 training days and say, oh, I got stronger on Thursday, because you might have been able to have done 3 sets on Tuesday. You actually don't know because you didn't do it. So you don't have that point-by-point comparison. Again, increasing volume can be useful, but it is not a form of progressive overload. 2, bodybuilders actually fundamentally misunderstand the function of progressive overload. See, progressive overload is not the cause of progression in training, it's actually the result. A well-structured training program will result in progressive overload. It will engender and create progress. And so if you're not making progress, that means that progressive overload isn't possible. But there is some nuance here, right? Like this is kind of confusing. Let me give you again another concrete example. Let's say you're squatting and your absolute 10 rep max is 405 for a set of 10. So on Monday, you go in and you do that 405 for 10 reps. The next week, you probably can't get 410 for 10. You probably can't get 405 for 11. But you might be able to get 407.5 for 10, or you might be able to repeat it again and maybe add some pauses or slow down the eccentric or otherwise make the movement more difficult. And if you find a way to eke out those little bits of progress there, add those extra layers of difficulty, you're actually going to make more progress in the long term. So again, progressive overload is the result of proper training, but you also might need to nudge it and push it along the way. Lastly, the biggest issue with bodybuilders is that sometimes they just don't do progressive overload at all. I typically hear this from older lifters where they'll say something like, oh, well, you can't expect to get stronger for forever, or I used to do progressive overload and I don't anymore. I mean, that's true. You can't get strong infinitely, but that's not what progressive overload is about. It's about strength changes over time. So yes, in any one given session, you may not be able to make a PR, but over a 3 or a 6 or a 12-month period, you absolutely need to be getting stronger. And that's one of the keys to progressive overload. It's not just a linear march forward. You'll often need to take 2 steps back so you can take 3 steps forward, or with more advanced trainees, maybe you'll take 11 steps back so you can take 12 steps forward. The point is that your strength or your performance and the difficulty of your training needs to increase over time. Otherwise, you'll hit plateaus and you'll stall. Now, the second big mistake that I see bodybuilders make in their training is that they rotate their movements too frequently. They'll begin a training program, they'll train really hard for 4 to 6 weeks, they'll hit a wall, and they'll immediately start subbing out their movements. The problem with this is when you start doing a new movement, most of the gains you make are primarily neuromuscular. What that means is that your body is essentially learning how to perform that movement more efficiently, and you're probably not building new tissue. You're not actually getting bigger, you're just acquiring a skill. So if you learn a new movement and then sub it out and then learn a new movement and sub it out, you're actually not getting anywhere. You're just treading water over time. And the truth is, often the best gains are made when you've been sticking with a movement for a long time and you're really digging down and eking out those last tiny bits of progress. That's where real muscle tissue is built. So don't just sub out your movements every time you hit a wall. Figure out how to get through that wall and keep going. Now, lastly, the biggest mistake I see bodybuilders making in their training is that they just don't write down their workouts. I'm not saying you need a legal pad and a pen, but you need to be recording your sessions in some form or fashion, or else otherwise you can't track progress. I mean, sure, like if last year you were benching 225 and this year you're benching 315, that's progress. But there's a lot of time in between there, and you need to be tracking those micro progressions to make sure that your training is on track. Let's take something less extreme too, right? Like a lateral raise. You do the 15-pound dumbbells on Tuesday and you get 15 reps. Then next week you get 17 reps. Are you going to remember that? Are you going to be able to track that? No, you need to write it down, and that way you can observe these trends over time and make sure that you're moving forward. If you fix these mistakes in your training, you will make better progress.